Welcome to the Dynasty Files, where history speaks for itself. Today, we uncover one of history's bloodiest and most bizarre rebellions, when a failed student claimed to be Jesus Christ's brother and tore China apart. This is the Taiping Rebellion. Part 1. The number nobody believes. There was a war that killed more people than World War I, and almost nobody outside Asia has ever heard of it. Can you believe that? According to modern historians, the death toll ranges from 20 to 30 million. From the work of Xia Mingfang to Stephen Platt, scholars confirm the staggering scale. Of course, wartime statistics are never perfectly accurate, but what cannot be denied is that this was one of the deadliest conflicts of the 19th century. Some sources push the number as high as 70 million when factoring in famine and disease, though most academics consider that estimate extreme. To put this in perspective, in 1860, the entire population of England was roughly 20 million. This civil war wiped out the equivalent of 1 to 3 Englands in just 14 years. It exceeded the combined casualties of all the Napoleonic Wars. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 1 to 3 Englands gone. And the man who lit this fuse was not a famous general, not a cunning politician. He was a village school teacher who failed the civil service exam 4 times, collapsed into a fever dream, and woke up believing he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Sounds like the plot of a horror film crossed with a religious thriller? But this is history. History with names, dates, and bones still buried beneath the streets of Nanjing today. In 1850, the world was transforming at breakneck speed. In the West, the Industrial Revolution was reshaping civilization. Steam-powered ships were cutting across oceans, carrying goods and colonial ambitions. But in the East, at the heart of the Qing Empire, time seemed to be running backward. China was a colossal body hemorrhaging from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. After the humiliating defeat in the First Opium War, the Qing dynasty's credibility hit rock bottom. Silver drained overseas in exchange for opium shipments. Officials were corrupt to the marrow. Landlords exploited without mercy. And on top of it all, natural disasters, famine, floods, plagues, hammered the voiceless masses relentlessly. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was not simply another Chinese peasant uprising, not like the revolts of Chen Sheng or Huang Chao that dotted Chinese history like clockwork. It was something East Asia had never seen before: a full-scale ideological war. Religion, politics, and violence fused into a compound of terrifying destructive power. Neither side knew the meaning of mercy. The most prosperous cities of southern China, Nanjing, Hangzhou, Wuhan, became furnaces one after another. When Taiping forces captured a city, they hunted down everyone they called demons, meaning anyone loyal to the Qing court, or simply anyone who did not believe in their doctrine. When imperial forces recaptured those cities, they retaliated with massacres even more savage. Along the Yangtze River, across rice paddies that had fed an empire for centuries, corpses piled so high they blocked the current. In besieged cities, people ate moss, ate clay, and ultimately ate each other. These are not folk tales. Western missionaries present at the scene documented every detail with the clinical detachment of an autopsy report. Some regions lost 50, even 70% of their population. There were villages where even the sound of a rooster crowing or a dog barking became a luxury. Only the silence of death remained. We often speak of World War I with horror, the mud-filled trenches and poison gas of Verdun and the Somme. But half a century earlier, in the East, humanity witnessed a nightmare even more devastating. A war where the line between faith and madness was erased completely. So why? Why could a bizarre cult, worshipping a grotesquely distorted version of Christianity, defeat the professional armies of the largest empire in Asia? Why were dirt-poor peasants willing to throw themselves onto swords for the promises of a madman? Any modern psychiatrist would diagnose that man with grandiose delusions. Without the blind conviction that they were carrying out God's will, those farmers could never have held weapons for so long. And without the leader's delusions, the war might have ended years earlier, sparing countless innocent lives. The answer begins in a small village in Guangdong, where a bright child bore the weight of his entire clan's hopes. The price of his failure would ultimately be paid not by one family, but by half of China. Famine, floods, and plague were the perfect catalysts for an explosion. But every explosion needs a spark. And this spark did not come from a general or a statesman. It came from a hallucination. A dream born in a fever would set half of China ablaze. But before we tell that story, let us zoom out to the bigger picture. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was not merely a military event. It was a psychological earthquake that challenged every core value of Chinese civilization. It attacked Confucianism. It attacked the family structure. It attacked a hierarchical order that had stood for millennia. It promised a heavenly kingdom where all were brothers and sisters, land would be divided equally, and men and women would be equal. But behind those beautiful promises lay iron discipline built on fear and fanaticism. A hybrid religious system where one man declared himself the brother of Jesus Christ. He believed God had sent him to earth to sweep away demons and establish the kingdom of heaven. That absurdity is the key to understanding the scale of the tragedy. It all started with a strange dream during a high fever, a dream that transformed a failed scholar into an all-powerful cult leader. His name? Hong Xiuquan, pronounced roughly Hong Xiuquan. Part 2. The Failed Student and the Dream That Shattered China. In 1814, in the village of Guanlubu in Guangdong province, a boy surnamed Hong was born. His birth name was Hong Renkun, later changed to Hong Xiuquan, a name history would carve in bone. His family belonged to the Hakka people, a Han Chinese subgroup that had migrated south over centuries. They were perpetually treated as outsiders by local communities. Think of them as China's eternal immigrants, always the newcomers, always on the margins. The Hakka had one defining trait, an almost fanatical devotion to education. The imperial examination system was their only ladder out of the gutter. The Hong family was not wealthy, but fiercely determined. They pinned every hope on this son who showed brilliance from childhood. Hong Xiuquan was the family's golden ticket. He had memorized the Confucian classics while his peers were still chasing frogs in the rice paddies. In the villagers' eyes, he was a prodigy, the star who would bring glory to their remote corner of the empire. But the Qing examination system was a dream-crushing machine. Countless candidates crammed into tiny cells, little bigger than coffins, reeking of ink, sweat, and fear. The pass rate was mercilessly low. Imagine applying to Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford simultaneously. Each one accepts only one applicant out of 100,000. For a rural young man like Hong Xiuquan, each exam attempt meant his entire family had to scrimp and starve. That pressure weighed heavier than any sack of rice on a peasant's shoulders. 1827, failed. 1836, failed. 1837, failed for the third time. Each failure was a blade cutting straight into the self-worth of a man who always believed he was born for greatness. After the third attempt, Xiuquan's mind collapsed. He fell gravely ill, burning with fever for days, slipping into a prolonged state of delirium and hallucination. And in that fever dream, he saw another world. According to his own account, he was carried up to heaven. There he met a tall old man with a long golden beard, wearing a black robe, who called himself Father. The old man complained that the world had been seized by demons and that humanity had forgotten to worship him. Beside the old man stood a middle-aged man called Elder Brother, who handed Hong a sacred sword and a seal, commanding him to descend to earth to slay the demons and save the people. When Hong awoke, he began behaving strangely, declaring himself the heavenly king, adopting an air of divine authority. Pause for a moment. If this happened in the 21st century, we would call it a textbook case of psychotic episode triggered by extreme stress. Religious hallucinations in a patient suffering a mental breakdown. But in 19th century China, in a society already cracking at every seam, that deranged dream would become the spark that burned down half the country. At the time, though, nobody noticed. His family chalked it up to post-illness delirium. Neighbors whispered, then forgot. Xiuquan recovered, returned to his village teaching job, and resumed his ordinary life while preparing for his fourth exam. The strange dream was filed away in the drawer of memory. Nobody gave it a second thought. But fate had already written a different script. The turning point came in 1843, after his fourth failure in Guangdong. By now, Xiuquan was nearly 30, a completely defeated scholar with nothing left to lose. Every path society had laid out for him had slammed shut. He happened to reread a thin pamphlet called Good Words to Admonish the Age by Liang Fa, one of the earliest Chinese converts to Christianity, a pamphlet he had received years earlier but never read carefully. It presented a simplified version of biblical teachings about God, about Jesus Christ, about salvation. In the moment he read those pages, an electric current shot down Xiuquan's spine. Every fragment of the dream from 6 years ago suddenly snapped into perfect alignment. The golden-bearded old man was God, the Heavenly Father. The elder brother who gave him the sword was Jesus Christ. And he, Xiuquan, was God's second son, the biological younger brother of the Messiah, sent to earth to establish the kingdom of heaven right here on the ground. An extraordinarily dangerous combination had just been born. Christian beliefs filtered through the lens of a mentally unstable, failed scholar. It blended with ancient Chinese utopian ideals and layers of hatred toward the Manchu ruling class. The Qing Dynasty was a Manchu regime ruling over hundreds of millions of Han Chinese. In the eyes of many Southerners, they were foreign conquerors, demons who had stolen the ancestral homeland. When Xiuquan declared the Qing demons, he was not just founding a new religion. He was handing countless oppressed people a sacred justification to rise. If the Qing were demons, then destroying them was not rebellion. It was carrying out God's will. One man's personal bitterness had found its fulcrum in the rage of an entire people. He began smashing Confucius tablets in the school where he taught, an act equivalent to declaring war on the entire foundation of Chinese culture. Think of it as a priest storming into the Vatican and smashing the crucifix. He was fired, ostracized, but for a man who believed he carried a divine mandate, the world's rejection only confirmed that the world was under demonic control. The danger of Hong Xiuquan lay precisely here. He had sanctified hatred. He transformed the peasant struggle for survival into a cosmic holy war. Those who opposed him were not merely political enemies. They were enemies of God. And against God's enemies, no mercy was needed. Together with Feng Yunshan, pronounced Feng Yunshan, his closest friend and the true organizational architect behind the Mad Dream, Hong Xiuquan ventured deep into the mountains of Guangxi province. If Hong Xiuquan was the flame of inspiration, Feng Yunshan was the man who built the furnace, channeling wild heat into directed energy. There, in the most impoverished valleys of the empire, miners and farmers lived lives worth less than a water buffalo. He found crowds ready to believe anything, as long as it was different from their current hell. During those years hiding in Guangxi, Hong Xiuquan sharpened his beliefs day by day. He wrote hymns and devised austere rituals. He built the skeleton of an army that fused military discipline with religious fervor. He waited for the sign from God to begin the Great Purge. The Qing court in distant Beijing remained oblivious. They dismissed it as a petty bandit gang or a harmless local cult. But did Hong Xiuquan truly believe he was the brother of Jesus? Or was this merely the bloodiest political theater in history? The answer lies in what happened next, when that belief was turned into a war machine by someone far more cunning. Part 3. The God Worshipper's Society, when desperation meets the man who knows how to exploit it. Guangxi in the 1840s. Erase any romantic image of misty mountain landscapes. This was land the empire had abandoned. Jagged limestone peaks rose like enormous fangs around narrow, suffocating valleys. Fog and poverty blanketed the region year-round. This was not the fertile Yangtze Delta or the splendor of Beijing. This was the frontier, where imperial law was nothing but faded ink on paper, and a human life was worth less than a bowl of watery porridge. Miners, landless farmers, persecuted Hakka, all compressed here like gunpowder waiting for a match. If Hong Xiuquan was the soul, the man who painted a promised land in his hallucinations, then Feng Yunshan was the organizational architect. He was the one who transformed a deranged dream into a functioning system. To be clear, Feng Yunshan was not a military commander. He was a systems designer, building networks of believers, creating organizational units, drafting rituals, establishing communication channels between scattered groups across Guangxi. In modern terms, he was the systems architect, not the general. The military command role would later belong to someone else, but more on that shortly. While Hong Xiuquan was still in Guangdong composing prophetic poems, Feng Yunshan had plunged into the Thistle Mountain region. He did not come as a conqueror, but as a brother. He crawled into mine shafts, slept on cold dirt floors, shared bowls of sweet potato with Hakka miners. He told them something very simple. There is only one God, and he does not distinguish between rich and poor. In his eyes, you are children of heaven, equal to any emperor or mandarin. This was a devastatingly effective psychological strike. In Chinese society of that era, religion and social order were inseparable from Confucianism's rigid hierarchy. A peasant was born predestined to be a servant. Why did so many believe such an outlandish claim? Because it told them something no ideology in 2,000 years had ever said: that they deserved equality. Imagine you are a miner in Guangxi. Your entire life has been spent bowing to the landlord, bowing to the county magistrate, bowing to anyone wearing silk robes. Then one day, someone arrives and says, "You are a child of God. You have the right to stand up straight. And if you take up arms to slay the demons, God will welcome you into the heavenly kingdom." In the heavenly kingdom, all people are brothers and sisters. Land will be distributed equally. Men and women will be equal. No more crushing taxes. You do not need to believe. You just need to have been hungry long enough, beaten often enough, for that promise to sound more reasonable than reality. That was not just religion. It was a psychological bomb. Sweet and lethal. The God Worshippers Society was born, and it resembled nothing China had seen before. This was not Orthodox Christianity, nor was it Buddhism, Taoism, or a traditional secret society like the Triads. It was an unprecedented hybrid, a cultural chimera stitched together from fragments of the Bible, folk prophecies, and peasant dreams of utopia. Xiuquan kept the wrathful God of the Old Testament, the punishing, destroying deity, but he threw out entirely the compassion, forgiveness, and love your enemies teachings of the New Testament. Who were the demons? In the God worshippers' worldview, demons were not supernatural beings. Demons were the Buddha statues in temples, the Confucius tablets in schools, the Qing officials in their embroidered dragon robes, and the Manchu emperor himself sitting on the dragon throne in the Forbidden City. This hybridization was the movement's most powerful weapon. It was exotic enough to generate absolute devotion, yet familiar enough to dovetail with the long tradition of overthrow the Qing, restore the Ming that ran through China's secret societies. Think of it as the Spartacus revolt meets the People's Temple, class revolution dressed in messianic robes. When a family joined the God Worshippers Society, they had to surrender all their possessions to the sacred treasury, the communal fund. Houses, livestock, silver, everything. The concept of private property was abolished entirely. In return, they were fed, protected, and promised a place in heaven. Exactly the model of every extremist organization in history. Sever all previous ties, transform individuals into cells utterly dependent on the organization. Once you have surrendered everything you own, there is no road back. They became cells of a colossal organism, operating according to the will of a single brain. Fanaticism erupted into ritualized violence. Across villages throughout Guangxi, God worshippers stormed into temples, smashing 1,000-year-old Buddhist statues, burning ancestral tablets. In Chinese society, where ancestor worship was the foundation of filial piety, the thread connecting past to present, this was an act of absolute rupture. A total divorce from everything that came before. But that very rupture was the most effective chain. Once you have smashed your grandparents' memorial tablets with your own hands, there is nowhere to return. The door back was slammed shut by their own fists. The only remaining choice? March forward, fight for the heavenly kingdom, or die. Then a bizarre twist pushed the absurdity to a new level. In 1848, Feng Yunshan was arrested by local authorities, and Hong Xiuquan had to go into hiding. The movement was suddenly headless. In the chaos, a destitute charcoal burner named Yang Shuqing, pronounced Yang Shuqing, a man who was illiterate but possessed extraordinary cunning, suddenly collapsed to the ground, foaming at the mouth. Then he spoke in a deep, commanding voice and declared, God, the Heavenly Father, had descended into his body to deliver his holy will. Shortly after, Xiao Chaogui, another peasant, claimed he was the vessel of Jesus Christ, the elder brother. In any society with a rational foundation, this would be dismissed as cheap fraud. But in those starving, desperate mountain valleys, it was received as a miracle. And even Hong Xiuquan, when he returned, was forced to acknowledge it, because how could he deny his own father and elder brother? From that moment, Hong Xiuquan's authority began to be shared and manipulated. Yang Shuqing, speaking through the mouth of God, could command anyone, including the heavenly king himself. If Feng Yunshan was the organizational architect, then Yang Shuqing was the true military operator, the one who ran the war machine day to day. Religion was no longer about morality. It had become a tool for political and military governance. Every attack order, every internal purge was issued in the name of God. Who would dare argue with the Almighty? A ticking time bomb had been planted in the very core of the movement. The war machine began to turn. Believers forged spears from farming tools, cast cannons from melted temple bells. They trained for combat to the rhythm of hymns. Every morning, kneeling in prayer. Every afternoon, thrusting bayonets into dummies dressed in Qing official robes. Tensions between the god worshippers and local authorities escalated. Small clashes erupted. The first drops in a river of blood began to fall across the fields of Guangxi. The Qing court in distant Beijing sent troops to suppress them, but every bullet only intensified the fervor. Believers were convinced that divine spirits protected their bodies, that death was merely a doorway to eternal glory. The court still dismissed them as petty troublemakers. But before that human torrent surged northward, it needed one final push. And it came from a small village with a name that was almost cruelly peaceful. Jintian, literally, golden fields. Part 4. Jintian ignites, the birth of a kingdom built on bones. Late 1850. The village of Jintian in Guiping County, Guangxi, became a cradle of the storm. The air was thick, not just with cold, but with unbearable tension. These were no longer quiet prayer meetings. This was the culmination of a storm compressed over an entire decade. Tens of thousands descended on the village, and they did not come empty-handed. Miners carried pickaxes and explosives. Farmers lugged homemade spears. Hunters brought battered muskets. They brought their families. They brought their last possessions, already converted into silver and deposited into the sacred treasury. And most importantly, they brought weapons. They all shared one visible mark. They had cut off their queues. This detail sounds small, but carried the weight of a death sentence. Under the Qing dynasty, the queue, that long braided pigtail, was not a hairstyle. It was the symbol of Han Chinese submission to Manchu rule. Cutting your queue was a declaration of war, a voluntary death warrant. No turning back. When those black braids fell into the mud of Jintian, every single person had burned the bridge back to their old life with their own hands. They were no longer subjects of the great Qing. They were rebels, or, as they called themselves, holy soldiers of the heavenly kingdom. January 11th, 1851, Hong Xiuquan's 37th birthday. But history remembers this date for a different reason. He donned brilliant yellow imperial robes, a color reserved exclusively for the emperor in Beijing, and declared the founding of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. The character Taiping means great peace, an irony that would become grotesque. War drums thundered, echoing through the valleys of Guangxi. Amid swirling incense smoke and murmured prayers, he proclaimed himself the Heavenly King and established a new kingdom. God's justice would replace the corruption of the Manchu demons. 5 commanders were crowned as kings: Yang Shuqing, the Eastern King; Xiao Chaogui, the Western King; Feng Yunshan, the Southern King; Wei Changhui, pronounced Wei Changhui, the Northern King; and Shi Dekai, pronounced Shi Dekai, the Shield King. The presence of Wei Changhui is worth noting. He was a wealthy landlord with local influence who had been constantly bullied by corrupt officials. The fact that a man like Wei contributed his entire fortune and thousands of retainers showed the movement had outgrown the framework of a simple peasant revolt. Wei's money provided massive financial and logistical muscle, transforming a cult into a real army. This was also when the leadership structure's seeds of destruction were locked in place. Each king commanded his own army with absolute authority in his domain. All were technically subordinate to the heavenly king, but real military and administrative power was gravitating steadily toward the Eastern King, Yang Shuqing. He was the only one who could channel God's voice to command even the heavenly king himself. If Hong Xiuquan was the deluded heart, Feng Yunshan the designing brain, then Yang Shuqing was the iron fist gripping the war machine. The first battle erupted right at Jintian's gates, a moment of immense symbolic importance. Had the Taiping forces lost here, history would have recorded them as just another secret society crushed in its cradle. But what the Qing generals did not expect was the power of blind faith. The imperial troops, the Green Standard, ethnically Han Chinese provincial troops, and the banner armies, the Manchu elite military caste that had conquered China 2 centuries earlier, had once been fearsome, but were now rotted through by opium and corruption. They were accustomed to bullying civilians, not facing men who believed themselves immortal. Taiping holy soldiers charged into battle lines screaming God's name, refusing to dodge bullets, because in their minds, every step forward was a step closer to heaven. Discipline forged through brutal military law fused with religious doctrine ground the Qing resistance to dust. The imperial soldiers panicked. It was not death they feared. They feared people who did not fear death. Imagine you are a Qing soldier, conscripted for a meal and a paycheck. You face an army of men who believe they are immortal. The terror is not in the enemy's weapons. It is in the blazing eyes of men who volunteer to die. The victory at Jintian was a decisive psychological blow. It proved to countless hesitating peasants that God truly stood with the long-haired rebels, that the demons could be defeated. After this battle, the Taiping forces adopted a rolling strategy, never staying in one place to be surrounded, moving constantly like a flash flood. Wherever they went, they burned their own homes behind them, severing every thought of retreat. They absorbed every underclass into their ranks, especially the Guangxi miners, men with iron endurance and deep hatred for the authorities. But precisely as the army surged northward in blazing confidence, an ominous detail went largely unnoticed. Hong Xiuquan began retreating into his inner palace. While countless people were sacrificing their lives for his earthly paradise, he spent his days drafting bizarre edicts and composing prophetic poetry. Military strategy left entirely to the other kings. The crack between the dreaming cult leader and the brutal reality of power had appeared. While the fires of Jintian still smoldered, the counter on 30 million lives had already begun ticking. Part 5. The Human Flood on the Yangtze. From Guangxi, the Taiping army did not march to conquer. They migrated. Picture a human torrent stretching for dozens of miles along the mountain trails of southern China. At the head rode cavalry units bearing brilliant five-colored banners. Behind them came tens of thousands of holy soldiers with crude weapons, but eyes ablaze with fanatic fire. In the middle of the column rolled carts carrying the elderly, women, children, and the entire sacred treasury. This was not simply a military campaign. This was a mobile nation searching for its promised land, where Hong Xiuquan had promised milk and honey would flow. The road to that promised land, with bitter irony, was paved with corpses. In 1852, the Taiping forces entered Hunan, and the war's true bloodthirsty nature was laid bare. The Qing court threw everything at them. At the ferry crossing of Quanzhou, an irreplaceable loss struck. Feng Yunshan, the Southern King, organizational architect of the movement, the man who had designed the entire god worshippers' apparatus, fell under Qing gunfire. Think about that. Feng Yunshan fell, and with him, another version of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. The version with rationality, with organization, with a moral compass, fell as well. His death was not merely losing a general. It was losing one of the few sober voices capable of restraining the monsters sleeping within the movement. Almost no one else in the leadership possessed both the intellect and the moral authority to keep the Heavenly Kingdom dream from becoming a nightmare. News of his death spread through the ranks like a funeral bell. Soldiers wailed on the battlefield. Many hurled themselves at the Qing lines as if seeking death. Without Feng Yunshan, the Heavenly Kingdom lost the rare figure who had both strategic vision and the respect of every faction. He was the man who kept the co-founders from tearing each other apart. His death was not just a military loss. It was a fatal blow to the internal balance of power. Feng Yunshan was the only person with enough prestige to check the ambitions of the Eastern King, Yang Shuqing, while simultaneously soothing the Heavenly King's worsening delusions. When he fell, the last rational thread holding the movement together snapped. Pause on that. The one man who could have steered this movement towards something less monstrous was gone. And no one would replace him. Ever. Grief transformed into fury. The Taiping forces unleashed their rage on every city in their path. Guilin, Changsha, heavily fortified strongholds, were assaulted with unprecedented savagery. Look through the eyes of a Qing soldier standing on the walls of Changsha. Below him was not a professional army employing textbook tactics, but an ocean of humanity screaming hymns, charging into cannon fire as though bullets were rain. Fear spread like a virus through the imperial ranks. Though they failed to take Changsha, the Taiping forces learned a critical lesson. Fortified cities required time and logistics, but the waterways lay wide open. The Yangtze River, the great dragon connecting east and west, the aorta feeding the empire, was the key. Whoever controlled that river controlled the fate of China. At Yuezhou, one of the greatest strokes of battlefield luck in military history occurred. Qing troops panicked and fled, abandoning thousands of warships, large and small, along with enormous stockpiles of weapons and ammunition. Overnight, an army of barefoot miners and peasants suddenly possessed the most powerful river fleet of the 19th century. The transformation was so stunning it defied belief. Like a guerrilla band suddenly capturing an entire navy, the Yangtze became a military highway. Tens of thousands of boats cut through the water, blanketing the river's surface with yellow banners. War drums and brass horns echoed between the cliff walls of the three gorges. The Taiping forces moved at dizzying speed, leaving the slow-marching imperial infantry far behind. In January 1853, Wuchang fell, the first provincial capital to fall to the rebels. The collapse of Wuchang sent a shockwave all the way to Beijing. For the first time, the Xianfeng emperor truly trembled. The great granaries of central China were cut off. Silver and rice ceased flowing northward. But at Wuchang, the world got its first glimpse of the true cost of the heavenly kingdom. The Taiping forces imposed their new order immediately. Confiscation of all civilian property, separation of men and women into separate barracks, including married couples. Any contact between men and women, even between husband and wife, was deemed fornication. Punishment? Death. Hong Xiuquan declared this a period of purification. Only when the demons were swept away and the heavenly kingdom fully established would men and women be allowed to live together. Tens of thousands of Wuchang residents, who had never heard of God or Jesus Christ, were suddenly hurled into a reality where the slightest gesture could lead to the executioner's blade. Wuchang was merely a way station. The true destination lay downstream, Nanjing, the former capital of the Ming Dynasty, the symbol of Han Chinese power. For the Taiping forces, this was the Jerusalem of the East, the city God had designated for his heavenly capital. The march from Wuchang to Nanjing unfolded at a pace that stunned the Qing court. According to the records in Zheqing Weijin Lu, a document compiled by Qing officials themselves, in just 2 months, Zhejiang and Anqing toppled like dominoes. Qing forces disintegrated after the very first wave of assault. Refugees fled upriver carrying horrifying stories about long-haired killers who showed no mercy, about bizarre rituals, about a king who called himself Jesus' brother. Fear traveled ahead of the army, and fear was their most effective vanguard. March 1853. The sky over Nanjing turned gray with gunpowder smoke. After a brief siege, mining engineers in the Taiping army detonated massive charges beneath the city walls. Those professional miners from Guangxi, expert at tunneling and handling explosives, they were the secret to breaching fortifications. An earth-shattering explosion ripped through the air. The most formidable wall in southern China crumbled. Taiping soldiers poured through like a dam bursting. According to the Jinling Zhe Bianji Lue, a first-hand eyewitness account from Nanjing, 40,000 Manchu residents within the walls were hunted down and slaughtered. Soldiers and their families alike. Not a single one survived. Corpses floated so thick on the Yangtze that they blocked the current. To Hong Xiuquan, Manchu lives were offerings laid at the feet of God. Hong Xiuquan sat on a golden sedan chair carried by 8 bearers, entering through the shattered city gates. His eyes did not look at the dead beneath his feet, but toward the magnificent palaces, the place he believed God had prepared for his second son. The village school teacher who had failed the exam 4 times had captured one of the greatest symbols of power in Chinese history. This was the apex of the delusion. But behind the brilliant yellow banners and thundering hymns, the rise of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom had torn away the facade of Qing stability. It laid bare a naked truth. The dynasty had lost control of its own destiny. And now, at the pinnacle of their newly conquered power, one of the most brutal social experiments in history was about to begin. Part 6. Paradise on Earth, or the largest prison of the 19th century. Nanjing was renamed Tianjin, the heavenly capital, capital of paradise. And from day one, it resembled no other city on earth. It was simultaneously a giant monastery, a military barracks, and a slaughterhouse. First order of business: erase the past. Buddhist temples, Taoist shrines, Confucian halls, all demolished or converted into military warehouses. 1,000-year-old statues of gods and sages shattered into rubble. In Hong Xiuquan's eyes, everything belonging to Chinese tradition was demonic, garbage to be swept away to make room for God's reign. But the destruction of architecture was only the beginning. The real revolution lay in how they restructured human beings. Hong Xiuquan decreed the Celestial Land System, a land reform scheme whose slogan sounded like a dream. Wherever there is land, till it together. Wherever there is food, eat it together. Wherever there is cloth, wear it together. Wherever there is money, spend it together. Let no place be unequal. Let no person go hungry. This was absolute egalitarianism. It appeared before Western socialist theories had even reached Chinese shores. All private property was abolished. Money, jewelry, grain. Surrender it all to the sacred treasury. Hide even a single coin. Treason. The blade fell without hesitation. Every morning, tens of thousands lined up to receive meager rations, wearing identical clothes, wearing identical shoes, reading the same Bible, a version Hong Xiuquan had personally rewritten to suit his narrative. His method of cutting, splicing, and distorting the original scripture was identical to today's social media experts who cherry-pick information to construct an alternate reality. If you repeat a lie often enough, loudly enough, in a sufficiently sealed environment, people will believe it. And in the heavenly capital, that environment was hermetically sealed. But the cruelest policy, the one that tore at the soul of Chinese society, was the forced gender segregation. The entire population of the heavenly capital was divided into male camps and female camps. Husbands could not see their wives. Fathers could not see their daughters. Brothers could not see their sisters. Any contact between men and women, even between legally married couples, was classified as fornication. The punishment? Death. Sound familiar? This is the formula of every mind control cult, from the 19th century to today. From polygamist compounds in rural America to Jim Jones's People's Temple in Guyana, the recipe is always the same. Separate families, shatter natural bonds, reduce individuals to complete dependence on the organization.
Stop.
Try to imagine it. You are a soldier. You have left everything behind. Home, land, your entire past, to follow the heavenly king. You have killed. You have burned temples. You have cut your queue. There is no going back. And the reward for your sacrifice? Night after night, you lie in your barracks, hearing the muffled sobs of your wife drifting over the wall. But if you dare climb over, both of you lose your heads. In the early years in the heavenly capital, every night the sound of weeping rose from rows of buildings separated by towering walls and relentless patrol squads. They fought for an ideal and were stripped of the right to love. Let that sentence settle for a moment. They fought for the ideal and were stripped of the right to love. But while countless people endured this enforced celibacy, behind the golden walls of the heavenly king's palace, reality was the exact opposite. Hong Xiuquan's palace was a separate universe where fantasy and extravagance reigned. The heavenly king never walked. He moved through his palace in small carts pulled by female attendants. Only women were permitted to serve inside the inner palace, because he trusted no man near his harem. According to Zhe Qingwei Jinlu and testimonies from palace women after the heavenly capital fell, Hong Xiuquan kept 88 consorts. The exact number remains debated, but hundreds of palace women is beyond dispute. While citizens outside were executed for a sideways glance at the opposite sex, the heavenly king wallowed in his private army of women. The man who decreed a ban on love for the world lived as the ultimate pleasure king. The missionary Issachar Roberts, who had once taught Hong Xiuquan Bible lessons in Guangdong, visited the heavenly capital in 1861, hoping to reconnect with his former student. What he witnessed left him shaken. A suffocating kingdom where Christian doctrine had been warped beyond recognition. Hong Xiuquan was drowning in theocratic delusion. Roberts had to flee the heavenly capital and later wrote bitter condemnations of the movement he had once hoped might Christianize China. This hypocrisy was not merely a personal stain. It was a fatal flaw in the moral foundation of the entire movement. Absolute power had transformed a failed scholar into a living god completely divorced from reality. Hong Xiuquan barely appeared before his people anymore, spending his days drafting bizarre edicts, rewriting the Bible, composing poems to lecture his concubines. The actual machinery of governance had fallen entirely into the hands of the Eastern king, Yang Xiuqing. On top of that came the book burnings. Thousand-year-old Confucian classics, priceless literary works, thrown into the flames. Reading Confucius, execution. Possessing a Buddha statue, put to death. Scholars were forced to compose hymns praising the heavenly king instead of writing about governance and ethics. The genuine intellectual class turned its back. Only two types of people remained, the deluded and the power-hungry opportunists. But there was a strange paradox amid the nightmare. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was the first movement in Chinese history to proclaim gender equality. Women were freed from foot binding, the barbaric practice that had mutilated the feet of hundreds of millions of women over nearly a millennium. They could take examinations, hold official positions, and even bear arms in battle. Taiping women soldiers, thousands of barefoot women carrying spears, terrified Qing troops. Historical records describe battles where female soldiers charged the front lines, fighting with a recklessness that stunned the enemy. For the first time in 2,000 years of Confucian order, Chinese women stood tall on the battlefield. But that equality was a double-edged sword. Women who thought they had been liberated from Confucian chains were in fact locked into new ones. In the female camps, they were forbidden from seeing their husbands and children, forced into hard labor building walls and fortifications, brutally punished for any infraction. And behind the lofty declarations of equality, the kings hoarded concubines and palace women for themselves. Liberation turned out to be just another form of slavery. A dense network of informants blanketed the city. Walls had ears. Eyes were everywhere. A single complaint, a sigh of longing for one's wife, a whisper of doubt about the heavenly king's dream. Any of these could lead to the executioner's block. Religion had been successfully weaponized into a tool of total control. A 19th century prototype of Big Brother from George Orwell's 1984. Yang Xiuqan wielded his God descending trick as a terrifying political weapon. Whenever he wanted to pressure Hong Xiuquan, he would collapse, foam at the mouth, then announce that God was speaking through him. Hong Xiuquan was trapped in a cage of his own making, living in a gilded palace but with his mind perpetually balanced on the edge of a sword. Yet despite the harshness, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom stood for years. Why? Because for many desperately poor people, even a promised land soaked in tears was still better than the reality of being ground under the heel of the collapsing Manchu Qing court. Or simply, they had no choice. Once branded a rebel, death was the only outcome if the heavenly kingdom fell. And perhaps most terrifying of all was the silence of ordinary civilians, trapped between two ideological firing lines, belonging to neither side, but paying the price for both. The heavenly capital was a colossal pressure cooker. Delusion, ambition, fear, all compressed to the breaking point. Yang Xiuqan began openly challenging Hong Xiuquan's authority. The kings eyed each other with suspicion and hatred. And when saints begin seeing devils in each other's eyes, that pressure cooker was about to explode in a storm that reeked of death like nothing the world had seen. Part 7. When brothers in Christ cut each other's throats. So what happens when men who call themselves saints begin seeing each other as demons? In 1856, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom stood at its military zenith. The main Qing encampment outside Nanjing had just been destroyed, relieving years of siege pressure. Taiping territory stretched across the rich Yangtze Delta. Outside observers believed the Qing dynasty was on the verge of collapse, just a matter of time. But inside the heavenly capital, a poison far deadlier than cannonballs was seeping into the marrow. A poison no army could manufacture. Arrogance, greed, and delusion pushed to their absolute limits. By this point, the Eastern king Yang Xiuqan was emperor in all but name. He held total control over military operations, politics, and the economy. And his deadliest weapon was not his army. It was his Spirit Possession Act, now elevated to an art form. Whenever he wanted to bend the heavenly king to his will, he would collapse and announce that God was speaking through him. And the heavenly king, Jesus Christ's own brother, had to kneel before an illiterate former charcoal burner, receiving rebukes, even physical punishment, in the name of the Heavenly Father. This humiliation compressed inside Hong Xiuquan like a block of TNT. But he dared not resist, because resisting God would mean denying the very religious foundation he had built. The inventor of the game had become a prisoner of his own rules. The final straw came in August 1856. During one of his spirit possession episodes, Yang Xiuqing forced Hong Xiuquan to grant him the title Wan Sui, 10,000 years, an honorific reserved exclusively for the heavenly king. In the language of Chinese power, this was a direct declaration of war. Hong Xiuquan, though perpetually lost in his religious fantasies, was lucid enough to recognize death approaching. He secretly dispatched urgent orders to the northern king Wei Changhui and the Shield King Shi Dakai, commanding them to return to the capital to rescue the throne. A rain-drenched night in early September 1856. Wei Changhui, a man who harbored deep personal hatred for Yang Xiuqing, led 3,000 elite soldiers in a covert infiltration of the heavenly capital, not to fight the Qing, but to slaughter their own brothers in faith. The Eastern King's compound, once a symbol of opulence and power, became a killing floor. In the lightning flashes of the night storm, Northern King's soldiers swept through like ghosts. No distinction was made between old and young, man and woman. Yang Xiuqing was dragged from his bed and killed on the spot. But Wei Changhui did not stop there. The frenzy of power and hatred drove him to order the extermination of every family member, subordinate, and soldier under the Eastern King's command. By morning, the stench of death overpowered the smell of rain. The canals of the heavenly capital ran dark red. Then came an even more diabolical scheme. Wei Changhui announced that the heavenly king would punish him for killing the Eastern King. He invited all of Yang Xiuqing's remaining followers to witness his public flogging. When thousands of unarmed people gathered in the square, he sealed the gates and opened fire. This was not a battle. It was a mass execution in broad daylight. More than 20,000 people, the most battle-hardened warriors, the most capable organizational minds of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, died under the blades of their own comrades. Bodies were piled into mountains at the city gates, then dumped into the Yangtze, drifting downstream like a message of death. 20,000, killed not by their enemies, but by their own brothers in faith. Let that sink in. The Shield King Shi Dakai, the most talented and most honorable of the kings, returned to the heavenly capital and was horrified by the devastation. He spoke out in protest. Wei Changhui's response? An immediate order to kill him. Shi Dakai barely escaped by climbing over the city wall, but his entire family left behind was massacred to the last person. By this point, the heavenly capital was no longer the capital of paradise. It was hell on earth, where delusion had curdled into pure madness. Hong Xiuquan stood on the upper floors of his palace, watching the man who had carried out his orders transform into a monster even more terrifying than Yang Xiuqing. Fearing for his own life, he switched allegiances yet again, allying with remaining generals and the populace to overthrow Wei Changhui. The northern king's head was eventually displayed on the city gates, ending two of the most harrowing months in the heavenly capital's history. The Tianjin incident of 1856 was not merely a military coup. It was a strategic catastrophe that permanently altered the course of the war. The damage was irreversible. First, the core leadership class, the men who had risen together at Jintian, were now dead, murdered, or gone. Shi Dakai, disillusioned and fearing Hong Xiuquan's paranoid suspicion, led tens of thousands of elite troops away from the heavenly capital. He set off on his own separate campaign westward, never to return. Xiuquan's fate is one of the most tragic chapters. Leading his army in a wandering campaign across western China for 7 years, he was finally cornered by Qing forces at the banks of the Dadu River in Sichuan province. The river was in flood, supplies were gone, tens of thousands of his soldiers faced certain death. Xiuquan chose to surrender himself to the Qing, trading his own life for the survival of his men. Before the execution ground, he was sentenced to lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, hundreds of blade strokes carving into living flesh. Yet according to historical records, he did not utter a single cry. Even his enemies were awed. A moment of silence for Xiuquan, the one king who chose honor over survival and paid the full price. His death closed the last window of hope that the heavenly kingdom could be reformed from within. Second, and most critically, legitimacy shattered. A cult that preached brotherhood, that promised God's salvation, had butchered its own people with a savagery exceeding anything their external enemies had done. Faith, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom's most powerful weapon, was broken. From this point forward, the machine no longer ran on belief, but on pure fear. And a machine running on fear can only drive in one direction. The gates of hell in a war of total annihilation were now thrown wide open. Part 8. 70 million. When neither side knew mercy. Spring 1857. A farmer in Anhui province walked out to a field he had been plowing the week before. But on the furrows, instead of rice seedlings, lay the body of a soldier, face down in the mud, allegiance unknown. The farmer did not dare turn the body over. To turn it over would be to identify a side. And choosing either side meant death. That was the reality for countless ordinary people after the Nanjing incident. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom had become a machine running without a brain. The Qing court smelled the fresh blood of a weakening enemy and decided to deliver the killing blow. The period from 1856 to 1864 was no longer a conventional civil war. It mutated into a war of annihilation. The line between soldier and civilian was erased entirely. The Qing, having realized their regular banner armies were utterly useless, made a decision that would permanently alter the power landscape. They authorized local gentry to raise their own militias. Most prominent among them, the Xiang army of Zhengguofan, pronounced Zhengguofan. Zhengguofan was a Confucian traditionalist to the marrow. He viewed the conflict not through a military lens, but as a civilizational death struggle. To him, the Taiping rebels were heretics who had desecrated Confucius, desecrated ancestral spirits, desecrated the cosmic order itself. If the heavenly kingdom won, everything the literati held sacred would be obliterated. That ideological hatred led to merciless tactics. Scorched earth, total siege, rip out the weeds by the roots, leave not a single sprout. The Taiping forces, desperate to sustain the heavenly capital's survival, responded in kind. The result? The greatest humanitarian catastrophe of the 19th century. No contemporary Western war came close. Look at a map of China at the time. The lower Yangtze region, once the throbbing economic heart of the empire, had become a dead zone. Picture an Anhui farmer. At dawn, Taiping soldiers sweep through and confiscate every grain of rice in the name of the sacred treasury. By dusk, imperial troops storm in and burn his house on suspicion of aiding the enemy. He stands amid the ashes, belonging to neither side, and both sides want him dead. His wife clutches their infant and runs, but every road is a dead end. To the north, imperial troops. To the south, Taiping troops. All around, scorched fields reeking of char. That was the fate of countless families, crushed between two ideological millstones. The dike systems along the Yangtze and the Yellow River were either abandoned or deliberately destroyed, flooding used as a weapon to halt the enemy's advance. Water surged in, bringing disease. Famine ravaged with an intensity beyond words. In besieged cities, Nanjing, Hangzhou, a silver ingot could buy only a bowl of watery gruel. When the rice ran out, grass, bark. When the bark ran out, clay pressed into stomachs to stop the cramping. And finally, the detail that history records in a tone chillingly matter-of-fact. Open-air markets selling human flesh appeared. Mothers traded children with one another so they would not have to butcher their own. Western missionaries and contemporary Chinese scholars documented every detail, not horror fiction, but the reality of China in the 1860s. The figure of 30 million dead, or by the most pessimistic estimates, up to 70 million, did not come primarily from swords or cannons. The vast majority perished from the inevitable consequences of war. Starvation as fields lay fallow, dikes went unrepaired, and trade routes were severed. And from epidemics, cholera, dysentery, malaria, erupting from unburied corpses, contaminated water supplies, and cities where the living and the dead were pressed together. The devastation escalated further when Western powers entered the picture. The timing was catastrophic. From 1856 to 1860, Britain and France were fighting the Second Opium War against the Qing, burning the Summer Palace, forcing humiliating treaties. The Qing court was fighting on two fronts simultaneously, stretched to the breaking point. But once the Second Opium War ended in 1860, the calculus shifted. The Western powers had secured their trade concessions. Now, a Taiping victory threatened those very concessions. So the British and French pivoted, from fighting the Qing to propping them up. The ever-victorious army, first under Frederick Ward, then under the legendary Charles Chinese Gordon, brought rapid-loading rifles, heavy artillery, and armored steam gunboats. The West's industrial killing technology was poured into a battlefield already drowning in death. The rate of slaughter surged. The worst atrocities lay not in the weapons, but in the extermination policies when imperial forces recaptured territory. Zheng Guofan and his commanders believed the only way to rip out the roots was to eliminate everyone connected to the god worshippers. In every recaptured city, massacres lasted for days. Long hair, killed on the spot. Guangxi accent, the blade fell. Unable to recite the Confucian classics, dragged out and executed. Corpses littered the streets. Bodies choked the Yangtze so thickly that British steamships struggled to navigate through. While untold thousands fell outside, Xiuquan still sat in his golden palace, sinking deeper than ever into hallucination. When subordinates reported the food supply was gone, he issued a holy decree. God would send manna, food from heaven.